I just wanted to say thank you to you guys for coming out. We're just getting started with our fall Africana lecture series. Oh yeah, I should put his little thing back on. Okay. We're just getting started with our fall Africana lecture series, and it promises to be a very good year. So I also wanted to let you guys know kind of an overview of what's going to happen in the fall and a little bit in the spring. We've got a few speakers and a few very noteworthy speakers. On Monday, November 12th, Professor Kwame Anthony Appiah from Princeton University is coming as a part of, he's coming to deliver a big fall Africana Studies lecture, but he's also coming as a part of the Villanova Center for Liberal Education. So that's on Monday, November 12th, and also in February, and I think it's the 19th, but we'll be sending out emails and posters and everything. Historian Darlene Clark-Hine is coming in February, and she is a noted historian of African-American history and women's history. And so she's coming in February. And then Arnold Rampersad, who is a noted scholar of African-American literature, is coming along with, I think it's John Wright, and they're going to be talking about Ralph Ellison and doing it's called the Ellison debate. And so they're going to be sort of taking different positions and talking. That'll happen in the spring also. So we've got a wonderful lineup, and so I just want to encourage you all to come. And I've got some Africana Studies brochures, which I would love if you guys would take out to your friends and people who might be interested. So I'll leave them on the table, and then you can get some. Our speaker today is Professor Giselle, is it Lisa or Liza?
Lisa.
Lisa Anatol. And she comes from the University of Kansas. She's Associate Professor of English there. And I have known Professor Anatol for many, many years. We went to graduate school together, and so she's a very dear friend. She is also not a stranger to Villanova, because when I went out on maternity leave 10 years ago, she took over the rest of my classes as well. So she's been back and forth around here for a long time. She did her undergraduate work at Yale University, where she was an English major. And she did her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, where she was also did it in English. And I just want to tell you a couple of her publications, because she's doing interesting stuff and kind of diversified stuff. She has an edited collection called Reading Harry Potter, Critical Essays, and it was published by Greenwood Press in 2003. And she's kind of, I guess, a pioneering scholar in terms of working with Harry Potter as critical text, and not just as a sort of popular cultural phenomenon. She also has written on sort of maternity in African-American literature. Her most recent article is Maternal Discourses in Nalo Hopkinson's Midnight Robber. She has written on Derek Walcott. She has written on Jamaica Kincaid, Audre Lorde. The list goes on. And she is just a wonderful scholar. And today she is going to be talking to us about vampires in Caribbean literature. And this comes from her larger book project, which is called The Things That Fly in the Night, Images of Female Vampirism in Literature of the African Americas, which is a book-length manuscript that seeks to explore the cultural implications of vampires in the African diasporic folk traditions, and to investigate the recent proliferation of narratives among writers of African descent, like Jamaica Kincaid, Edwidge Danticat, Octavia Butler, and Nalo Hopkinson. So I'm really pleased that she's here, and I'd like you to help me welcome Professor Giselle Anatol.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to put these here since I won't be using them. And Crystal, maybe I can give you these handouts in case anyone comes in late, but I think they mostly went out.
Has a handout? No.
All right, yeah, people often ask, they say, you know, oh, we see that you've worked on Harry Potter, and then they ask, what are you doing now? And I say, I'm working on female vampires, and they look at me and they say, oh, well, I guess those are not connected at all, but they are connected in my brain in terms of looking at texts that people usually don't investigate with a critical eye. So, as Crystal mentioned, my current research project is entitled "The Things That Fly in the Night: Images of Female Vampirism in Literature of the African Americas." And I am looking to explore this recent proliferation of these narratives by Caribbean diasporic, and African American women writers that feature female vampires. My overarching argument is that these writers deplore the vampire figure, once only threatening and demonic, but now suggestively productive, as a trope for female mobility, sexual expressiveness, and racial and cultural empowerment. When I was growing up, I was raised on tales of the Soucouyant, and you'll see that's the handout. I'll talk about that handout in a little while, but that's the description. The Soucouyant is a she-demon of my family's Trinidadian folk culture, but she's also found in the lore of Dominica, Barbados, Jamaica, Guyana, Haiti, Guadeloupe, and also the southern United States. Sometimes called Voland, old hag, or simply hags, these old women are said to shed their skin at night and attack their neighbors, sucking their victims' blood before returning home to redon their slippery outer coverings. Soucouyant are also believed capable of turning into balls of fire before taking flight. As a little girl, I was terrified and yet awed as my Auntie Yolande would pull up her pants leg and show me the scar on her leg where she had gotten bitten by a Soucouyant. The physical evidence of the scar, the writing on the body, it terrified me, but still has always stayed with me as something fascinating. Stories such as this one have long gone unexamined in academic and non-academic circles, taken as mere old people's foolishness and superstitious fluff meant only to entertain or establish an exotic local color. As has been detailed in folklore scholarship, however, tales have coercive power and serve to instill cultural values and norms. The explicit message of the Soucouyant story is that we are all, quite literally, the disciplinary subjects of our neighbors. Of greater interest to me, however, is the social anxiety generated by a belief in the mysterious power of old women. Because the Soucouyant is typically categorized as the epitome of evil, stories about her effectively socialize women to obey patriarchal mandates and condition men to expect women to do so. Unlike the good woman who marries, is faithful and forgiving of her husband's transgressions, bears and nurtures children, and anchors the domestic space, the Soucouyant of conventional renderings is a woman who occupies a space completely outside the phallic order. Instead of using her body to be what Sidoni Smith identifies as the locus of patrilineal preservation, carrier of legitimate sons and the order those sons perpetuate, she not only satiates her individual physical needs, and thinking of the physical needs satisfied by sucking blood, right, drinking blood, but also the associated sexual desires. There have been a lot of studies about how semen and blood can be read interchangeably in a lot of vampire literature, in that they're both, there's this exchange of vital fluids. So not only does she do those things, but she completely abandons her physical body. Like Drusilla Cornell's Wild Woman, she is at once present and absent, everywhere and nowhere, and almost always a devouring figure. If the terror and revulsion that accompany Julia Kristeva's abject, and the abject is defined as those who mark the radical margins of civilized society, serve to safeguard civilization and preserve patriarchal law, Soucouyant, like other female vampires, are abject figures par excellence. Because Soucouyant lore overwhelmingly ascribes the condition to women, it links horror and loathing with the female body out of control, even as it shows the necessary role such figures play in the preservation of a normative society. However, unlike conventional vampires, the Soucouyant is not abject because she elicits the paradoxical sense of loathing and temptation generated by things that occupy the border between the living and the dead. And she instead arouses the ambivalent repulsion and fascination associated with the so-called unnatural border crossings of her repeated transformations, her ability to peel off her skin and turn into a fiery ball, not once, but night after night after night, as well as the transgressive sexuality implied by her nightly journeys. Although there have been several critical explorations of the vampire in the past 2 decades, and race as a metaphorical construct is sometimes considered, usually when thinking about the vampire as this racialized foreign other that invades and has the potential to corrupt pure blood. There has been no sustained investigation of the vampire as a privileged figure of the African America's cultural imaginary. The interrogation of New World narratives designed either to promote fear or to unravel the roots of that fear are crucial to our understanding of contemporary society, one that often absorbs texts without pausing to consider their racial and gender implications. For my talk today, I'll survey a few of the traditional incarnations of the Soucouyant and speak briefly about 1937, which I hope some of you might be familiar with. It's a short story by Haitian-American writer Edwige Danticat from her collection Creek Crack. And I think it best exemplifies how contemporary women writers attempt to revise the conventional paradigms. Traditional horror stories provide negative examples of behavior in order to compel social conformity and ensure social cohesion. As such, standard Soucouyant folktales entertain their listeners, but also encourage obedience through terror. Trinidadian author Elizabeth Nunez conveys as much in her 2006 novel Prospero's Daughter, even though the protagonist Carlos claims to be beyond believing in legends. Quote, Lucinda had told me stories about the Soucouyant. I know she wanted to scare me, to keep me within her boundaries. I didn't believe there was a Soucouyant under the tree outside our yard, an old woman who shed her skin at night and turned into a ball of fire. And Lucinda couldn't make me go to bed when I was not sleepy by frightening me with her tales, end quote. According to the folk narratives, good children are rewarded by spiritual protection from Soucouyant attacks, while bad children, and I put good and bad, of course, in quotation marks, might be the victims of all types of punishments, from those doled out by parents to those inflicted by supernatural forces. And the handout that I passed out, this is from Folklore and Legends of Trinidad and Tobago. And hopefully you can have a chance to read that in more detail. But folklorist Gerard Basson describes the Soucouyant as an elderly woman who lives alone at the end of the village road. Her home, on the edge of the geographical limits of her community, parallels her position on the cusp of society. She disobeys social mores by remaining single. She does not live with her parents, a husband or a lover, children, or other family, and for this she remains a suspicious figure. Distrust is further enhanced by Basson's specific reference to her economic status. As you'll see, she lives in not just any shack, but it's a miserable shack, and thus poverty is demonized as well. The Soucouyant occupies a literal and metaphorical space out of the accepted boundaries, and woman is made monstrous by her refusal to meet social norms. By emerging from her skin and flying in the night sky, the Soucouyant accentuates her flouting of the acceptable spaces for women to inhabit. She travels outside of the domestic sphere, as well as through an extra-worldly realm, flying in the sky, rather than in the physical landscape occupied by her neighbors, ordinary humans who remain rooted to the ground. Basson describes the Soucouyant's flight as in pursuit of a victim from whom she would, quote, suck his lifeblood clean, end quote. While it might be easy to conclude that the male pronouns in this passage have no gender implications other than the writer's old-fashioned use of he for a supposedly universal subject, one should not ignore the male anxiety that is revealed and soothed by the fact that it is specifically the village boys and men who pour salt into the Soucouyant's skin and come and get her with a drum of boiling tar. Far from the female-centered reinterpretation of the tales posed by many late 20th and early 21st century African-American women writers, Basson reveals how the Soucouyant has historically and rhetorically been used. In another version by C.R. Otley, which is a more fictionalized rendition of the folk story, the character of Mr. Jonesy has unknowingly been married to a Soucouyant for a score of years. He finds his wife's skin behind the door one night and fills it with salt, but once she returns and realizes that she has been discovered, Jonesy has a change of heart and washes the skin so that his wife can put it back on before sunrise. He receives no thank you from her, signaling her ingratitude despite the fact that he has just saved her life. Jonesy then proceeds to beat his wife with, quote, a licking such as only the low-class Negroes in the village gave their spouses, end quote, shocking the entire community. They conclude that she has either committed some grievous error or he has lost his grip on reality and gone insane. But because the reader or the listener has just learned of the true reason for the beating, he or she experiences a complete lack of surprise and is placed in the position to feel comforted by this example of domestic violence. According to the ideology the audience is expected to absorb, this woman is not merely evil for her bloodlust and vampiric activity, she is the epitome of coldness and selfishness, so greedy for blood that she cannot commit to a loving husband, no matter how devoted to her he might be. She is thus rightfully punished for being self-seeking, ungrateful, and too independent. And an interesting parallel of the story can be found in Nancy Rhymes' collection of slave ghost stories from the U.S. South. And she takes these stories from WPA narratives in the first half of the 20th century. In a story told by Rachel McCoy, the speaker recalls that, quote, all the slaves from her childhood knew about the woman who had a habit of going out every night. Her husband couldn't guess where she was gone. He didn't know she was a hag, end quote. One again notices the impropriety associated with the woman leaving the domestic space every night unescorted. Not only is her husband not in control of his wife's movement, but he is ignorant to what is going on in his household. Because bloodsucking, with its exchange of bodily fluids that conventionally occurs in the intimate space of the bedroom, has been read as a symbolic consummation of sex, the Soucouyant can further be interpreted as a woman censured specifically for sexual veracity. Reading vampirism according to the sexual metaphor, we see the Soucouyant in both Ottley's and McCoy's tales as women condemned for being too sexually promiscuous to be committed to one man. Furthermore, when Ottley refers to the Soucouyant as a, quote, licensed practitioner, end quote, who is able to be hired out, his story holds connotations of prostitution. The she-demon, damned for her sexuality, renders chastity among women as a social imperative. Because of the hypersexualization of black women in much of popular culture and the reactive push towards Victorian modesty within many arenas of the black community, sexuality then becomes one of the topics with which contemporary women writers of the book that I'm proposing grapple in their novels and short fiction. And I'd now like to turn to a few examples from the Francophone Caribbean before moving on to analysis of Danticat's short story. Some of you might be familiar with Joseph Sobel's Black Shack Alley, which was originally published in 1974 and set in Martinique. And in this novel, young José hears about bâton volant from his schoolmates. And to warn you now that we're moving on to the Francophone Caribbean, my name is Giselle Anatol, but I don't speak any French, so forgive me for my mispronunciations of French. One of his best friends, Variel, relates the story of a motherless boy who lived with his godmother. And Variel says, in the country, of course, a detail which attempts to distance the content of the folk tale from the educated middle-class village lives of the students. Variel continues on, quote, the godmother was a wicked, wicked woman, and she used to beat him. The boy's name is Polo. Demonizing her for her cruelty, the storyteller goes on to mention that the woman is without a husband, conjoining her independence with her physical brutality. He then relates how she secretly sheds her skin each night and hides it behind the bedroom door. After her flight and, quote, diabolical expeditions, she returns and redons the skin, quote, the way you put on a jacket and trousers, end quote. After one particularly harsh whipping and being sponged with brine, the boy dips the skin into the same salt water to punish his guardian. The story's conclusion arouses Variel's schoolboy listeners to let out a cry filled, quote, with vengeful horror and in a laugh of triumph, end quote. For the children, the overt moral of the tale is that an oppressed youth can win out over a malicious adult. The defeat of the parental authority figure holds great sway for the boys, all hemmed in by parents, neighbors, and a very severe schoolmistress. Significantly, however, readers note that all of the listeners are boys. The boys in the school are forbidden to play with the girls during recess, revealing a culture of starkly separated gender roles. When the godmother of Ariel's tale is unable to get her burning skin back on, she perishes in the sunlight of the dawning day. And, quote, since she had a fine shack and a large property, Polo inherited them. He bought a beautiful horse and married an adorable woman, end quote. This happily ever after scenario eradicates the powerful female, celebrates the male character who has killed and displaced her, and rewards him with a proper woman, one who is valued primarily for her physical looks. Some of you might be familiar with the fictionalized revisionist history of Tituba, the Barbadian woman from the Salem witch trials, and you might know her from Arthur Miller's Crucible, very commonly taught in high schools and college classrooms. And in the revision, Maurice Condé, who's a Guadeloupean writer, divests witchcraft and Caribbean spiritual practice of Vodun from their traditional satanic associations. In Condé's novel, Tituba's investment is described, bless you, as in healing and curing, not harming the people around her. She explains, Mama Yaya taught me the prayers, the rites, the proprietary gestures. She taught me how to change myself into a bird on a branch, into an insect in the dry grass, or into a frog croaking in the mud on the River Ormond whenever I was tired of the shape that I had been given at birth. The abjection associated with the blurring of boundaries in traditional Soucouyant stories is completely removed in Condé's version. Tituba's ability to cross over into the animal world in the form of a bird and move from land creature to air creature, or from mammal to insect or reptile, is configured in the affirmative. The transformation reads as ordinary and natural, empowering rather than troubling. The protagonist also explains that Mama Yaya, quote, taught me the sacrifices, blood and milk, the essential liquids, end quote. Again, two of the fluids that Kristeva specifically cites as having the potential to create revulsion, especially when they cross the border of the skin, moving from internal to external, simultaneously invoking both life and death at the same time, are endowed with purely positive power in this West African spiritual tradition. When Mama Yaya dies, Tituba does not mourn. She says, I did not cry when I buried her. I knew I was not alone and that three spirits were now watching over me. Condé blurs the boundary between life and death, but not to create horror. The fear of the undead is replaced in the Vodun framework by a belief that the two worlds are not so starkly separated and that deceased ancestors and the Loa can interact with the living. When it comes to the Soucouyant, however, Condé preserves the image of a folkloric figure imbued with the power to generate terror. And I find this really interesting. Tituba's mother, an Ashanti woman purchased by a Barbadian plantation owner, tells that plantation owner's wife stories that her own mother had related in the African village where she was born. Quote, she would conjure up all the forces of nature at their bedside in order to appease the darkness and to prevent the vampires from draining them white before dawn, end quote. Here, the vampires figure as Caribbean demons, countered by the fortifying Ashanti stories. Later, Tituba tells Elizabeth and Betsy Paris, the wife and daughter of the master who takes her to Salem, stories of, quote, people who had made a pact with the devil, zombies, Soucouyant, and the hag who rides along on her three-legged horse, end quote. Thus, Condé challenges stereotypical notions of voodoo, obeah, and witches, but does not extend the ideological inversion to the demonic characters of Caribbean lore. In the novel, Tituba's father, her adoptive father, Yao, whispers to her, quote, one day we shall be free and we shall fly back to the country where we came from, end quote. The image resonates with numerous tales about flying Africans. And Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison might be one that pops readily to mind. There is a folk tale called All God's Children Had Wings, collected by Langston Hughes and Arna Bontemps in the 1950s. And in this story, an old man with a forked beard is identified by the slave drivers as a devil, but he truly represents his enslaved community's salvation, helping them to literally fly away, perhaps symbolic of death and the proverbial better place, or perhaps representative of an escape to freedom in the North. Whether the purpose of the tale was to inspire runaways, give hope during the brutality of enslavement, flatter good slave owners, or provide the groundwork for change, the story situates the old man and all of the flying slaves in a positive light, very much the antithesis of the flying Soucouyant figures. Similarly, there's a character called Gang Gang Sarah from 18th century Tobago lore, who is portrayed as an African witch, trusted housekeeper, and loving wife. Her potential to fly back to Africa is lost because she consumes salt while in the Caribbean, but her potential to take wing is not viewed as either threatening or frightening. And this leads me into Edwidge Danticat's short story, 1937, where Danticat works and reworks the motif of flight. In the narrative, protagonist Josephine visits her mother in a prison for women convicted of being loup-garou. According to the local lore, such creatures are women by day, but generate wings of flame at night in order to fly from house to house and steal children's breath. So here we have the sucking not of literal blood, but more of this kind of essence of a lifeblood, like the one that's mentioned in the Besson handout. The evidence against the inmates, who have all received life sentences, is that they have many wrinkles, believed to come from repeatedly removing and refastening their skins. So watch out for the wrinkles. The anxiety grows as the women remain incarcerated. Their skins sag as they are literally starved to death, only serving to reinforce the guards' belief that they are somehow escaping their skins and cells each night. No explicit vampiric element accompanies Danticat's version of the folktale, but the protagonist observes that her mother's teeth are red, quote, as though caked with blood from the initial beating during her arrest, end quote. Really suggests the sucking of blood. Danticat opens the short story with the image of a crying Madonna. Quote, "My Madonna cried. A miniature teardrop traveled down her white porcelain face, like dew on the tip of early morning grass. When I saw the tear, I thought, surely, that my mother had died," end quote. Catholic faith and iconography and possibility of miraculous occurrences are brought sharply into view. Josephine reveals that the Madonna statue was given to her great-great-great-grandmother Défile by a French man who had kept her as a slave. Although the Madonna is worshipped by Josephine's mother, possibly as much for its link to past and future generations as for its religious significance, the connection between Christianity and enslavement is also made clear. The statue is made of white porcelain, reflecting the European complexions of traditional saints and spiritual icons. If not for the physical, mental, and cultural brutality of slavery, people of African descent might have openly maintained the religious beliefs of their West African ancestors, including worshiping the Loa and spirits whose appearances reflected their own. In addition, the great-grandmother's name holds a double meaning. As a form of défilé, which means to file past, it can be associated with parades and processions, stressing the woman's position as foremother and the bonds between the ensuing generations. So they hold up this figure of this great-great-great-great-grandmother, and she files past them to give them inspiration. It can, however, also suggest the objectification of enslaved people being filed past prospective buyers and slave owners. Further, défilé can also mean to defile, suggesting the violation of cultural identities and sexualized bodies endured during slavery. The author does work, however, to recuperate Catholicism and shift the focus from a European-centered, male hierarchical religion to one that has greater resonance in the lives of these African Haitian women. Josephine describes trekking to the Massacre River every year on the 1st of November with her mother and several other women. Does everybody know what November 1st is? What is it? All Saints Day. Close. And those are, and again, interesting juxtaposition. And the purpose of the ritual is not to praise God or any of the male saints, but specifically to remember and celebrate the lives of the women who were lost in the 1937 Dominican massacre that gave the river its name. These dead women are framed, like the Virgin Mary, as mothers. We were all daughters of that river, which had taken our mothers from us. Our mothers were the ashes, and we were the light. Our mothers were the embers, and we were the sparks. Our mothers were the flames, and we were the blaze. In Danticat's story, there are no official priests. All of the celebrants are women. There is no physical church building. The women pray on the shores of the river. There is no baptismal font. The women sit with their hands dipped in the river. In large part, the villagers' fear of the Soucouyant flight seems to go hand in hand with an anxiety of women's mobility. The women in 1937 who do not fulfill expected social roles are demonized and attacked. Maman, for example, is viciously beaten with rocks, sticks, and fists because, while staying with a friend, the friend's colicky baby dies. Fear of the unknown, in this case a misunderstood illness coupled with an unfamiliar woman in the town, leads to socially sanctioned violence, and the mob of strangers nearly kill the protagonist's mother before the police arrive. When Josephine sees her at the prison, she notes, quote, "Her face was swollen to 3 times the size that it had been. She had to drag herself across the clay floor on her belly. She was like a snake, someone who has no bones left in her body," end quote. The allusion to the snake calls forth biblical imagery, evoking the idea of serpents and women in collusion against man and God. Conventional tellings of the Soucouyant legend also situate women as evil in the garden, and the Soucouyant skin shedding resembled the molting of a snake. The threat that the female figures of the story represent is evident in Josephine's recognition that the shearing of her mother's head, that's done by the prison guards, is not intended to help the scalp wounds heal, but rather to humiliate her for venturing beyond the bounds of traditional womanhood. Quote, "Later, when I saw all the other women in the yard, I realized that they wanted to make them look like crows, like men," end quote. As the young protagonist leaves the prison, her mother says, quote, let your flight be joyful," end quote. Rather than avoiding associations with the Soucouyant's abilities and burying them in shame, she appears to be passing on the legacy of flight. Josephine reinforces the association when she then remembers her mother's stories of escape from the Dominican Republic in 1937, the year that provides the title of the story. Rafael Trujillo, the dictator of the Dominican Republic, ordered the massacre of thousands of Haitian immigrants on the Dominican side of the border. Fomenting a racialized anxiety under the guise of national interests, Trujillo labeled Haitian laborers in the Dominican Republic as, quote, "the enemies of peace, who are also the enemies of work and prosperity, keeping the nation in fear and menacing stability," end quote. So again, there's that link to economics and how that's really wrapped up in fear and generating fear. Thus, when Josephine's mother fled the Dominican Republic, soldiers attacked her, and she emerged on the Haitian side of the Massacre River, bloody from the river water, which was discolored by the wounded bodies of those who did not make it across, and she glowed red and appeared aflame. The protagonist proposes that the river gave her mother wings of fire. This allusion to fire further aligns the imprisoned woman with the Soucouyant, and the trait used by the majority of the population to condemn and scapegoat certain women becomes a symbol of flight and escape to safety. Danticat thus effectively transforms the conventional image of the Soucouyant and celebrates her potential. Furthermore, after Josephine's mother's death, the protagonist notes that the fellow prisoners in her mother's cell resemble angels hiding their wings. Identifying these women as angels recuperates them from their social construction as wicked and evil and reclaims them in the name of protective forces. Danticat appropriates the folklore figure to establish strength, purity, a connection between mother and daughter, and to revise notions of the evil woman in the Haitian community about which she writes. Unfortunately, the author suggests that the time has not yet arrived when these women can display their wings, their inherent powers, before the rest of the society. The angel's wings must remain hidden. Much work needs to be done before the larger society will reach the same state of awareness and appreciation as young Josephine, and the awareness of the writers and authors about whom I write. Thank you. I know that was lots kind of packed into a tight space, so I'd be happy to answer any questions or elaborate on any of the work here.
I actually have a question. I noticed, this might be an unfair question,
Okay.
because I know that you're focusing on
it looks like from the description of the project that you're focusing on Caribbean or
Well, it's kind of through the,
Caribbean associated or Caribbean born women.
and associated.
Like I'm thinking like Butler, Octavia Butler.
But no,
who-
right, who is not, who I identify as just African American.
Okay.
And also Jill Gomez, African American from the US. So it really ranges, and I think it was really helpful for me to find those hag stories from the WPA narratives, because again, right, there's as I argue elsewhere in the project, it's really impossible to kind of pin down where these stories come from and how they kind of moved throughout the Americas, but we do find them in Canada, in the United States, in the Caribbean, in South America. And so so I've used the word Soucouyant loosely in this paper, but actually in other parts of the book, I'm looking at female vampires, not necessarily the ones who shed their skin. So Octavia Butler, and I don't know if you all know her, she's a science fiction fantasy, or she died recently, writer. But her most recent novel, the one that was published just about the time of her death, is called Fledgling, and it's about vampires in North America, and there's no connection to the skin shedding. But she's just using the vampire figure. Again, she kind of posits vampires as a race of people, a race of people who live kind of to themselves, and it's a very kind of positive, it can be a very positive
And they're women?
form of community, women and men, but the women live separately from the men.
Okay.
But the protagonist, Shori, represents a new kind of vampire in that she's the, well, I don't want to spoil it for you if you haven't read it, but she's a new kind of vampire, and she brings in, she's black, and most of the rest of the vampires are white, and so it brings up, there's a certain amount of racism that occurs in this community that has already experienced a lot of prejudice because they are vampires, so kind of brings a lot of these elements
Because what I was going to
together.
ask about these African American figures, like you talked more about the Soucouyant and these Caribbean figures.
Yes, and yeah.
But I was wondering, like you mentioned Pilot,
Yes.
would she be a potential
Yes.
vampiric or Soucouyant figure
And-
for you?
yeah.
And what would other contemporary African American characters look like?
Pilot, I think there is actually a reference in Song of Solomon to Pilot coming out of her skin. And so that was really interesting and captivating for me. I think, and again, she's this very powerful woman. She lives alone. She doesn't rely on anyone else. She refuses to obey those dictates. If you remember the women in the family, they eat what they feel like when they feel like. They don't sit down to regular meals. She has her head shaved, all of these different things. And I think it comes around the time where there's a man who threatens her daughter, and she threatens him with a knife. And people say, they should have known, it's Pilot, and that she has so much power in the community, and she doesn't bow down to these social dictates. And so there are rumors around town that she can slip out of her skin, that she does have this somewhat supernatural power.
And of course she flies in the end.
Yes, right. So that, and then I also plan to have a chapter on film, and so I'm looking at the Blade movies, mostly Blade 1 and 2, and how women vampires are represented in those films. Blackula, if anyone has had the pleasure of seeing Blackula, it's a 1970s blaxploitation film where Blackula is an African prince who is transformed into vampire by Dracula, and kind of cursed forever, and then ends up in the United States and terrorizes LA, and that actually has really interesting political implications too in light of the 1960s and LA race riots and things like that are going on. So a figure of fear, but also a figure of empowerment for a black community. But the women vampires in that film are very passive in lots of ways. So it doesn't, even though there's a lot of empowerment going on in terms of race, there's not a lot going on in terms of gender. I also, if anyone had the pleasure of seeing Eddie Murphy's Vampire in Brooklyn, another not so big hit, but and rightfully so, I think. But Eddie Murphy plays a vampire who comes to the United States to look for a mate, and
It's like Coming to America.
It's like Coming to America, exactly. And he finds Angela Bassett, and Angela Bassett. Why did she choose this role? But she is a police detective who, unbeknownst to her, is half vampire, and so it's about her kind of fighting against her inner core. A lot of tragic mulata kind of stuff going on. So that's there too. So those would be some of the. And then, Jewel Gomez, the Gilda Stories. And Jewel Gomez is a lesbian writer, and so she uses the figure of the vampire, again, in ways that suggest empowerment for women. So she starts off with a young runaway slave in the 1800s who is turned into a vampire and then proceeds through several centuries, kind of detailing her experiences. Yes.
I know in normal vampire stories,
Yes.
Is it like that in that the Soucouyant?
Yeah, good.
Do they kill when they go out? Is that what they do? Or is it ever a time when it's just, I know you said that there's sexually promiscuous and all that, but is it always killing when they go out at night?
Right. It's interesting. It's not an immediate kill in the traditional Soucouyant stories. So it's this idea of going out and draining someone's blood slowly to get nourishment, or the way that I'm reading it, or other people might read traditional vampire stories over several nights. So in terms of like illicit liaisons, sexual liaisons. But in conventional vampire stories, also, there's not always the immediate kill. And I think it's really interesting to me. I plan to do a bit of analysis on Bram Stoker's Dracula, the book version, not the movie version. But I think a lot of people, their ideas of what vampires are, they think come from Stoker's Dracula, and some of those are true, but a lot of them really come from the incarnations of Dracula and vampires that come in the movies later, in later years. So there's a lot of sexual stuff going on in Stoker's Dracula, and I think a lot of the 19th century vampire stories, and that idea of the draining of the blood, the continual draining of the blood. I don't know if have you read that novel? Okay, so for those of you who might not have read it, so Dracula, when he comes to England, and he is draining the blood from Lucy, who is this wealthy young woman, and she gets sicker and sicker and sicker, and she looks like she gets paler and paler, and eventually she dies, or the people around her think that she's dead, but it ends up just being that she is now vampiric, and so she goes into her tomb and she comes out night by night and she preys on young children, and again she is kind of the antithesis of the proper young woman, right? She's not maternal, she's preying on children, in the same way the Soucouyants here, right, in that version, the Danticat version, right, that specifically is about draining the lifeblood or the breath of children. And Lucy also, when the men confront her in her vampiric form in the tomb, the word voluptuous is repeated over and over again, and she used to be very kind of pure looking. Her blonde hair turns black, which is another part of this transformation. And she's very languorous, and she's saying, come to me, come to me. And the killing of her, where she actually is killed, is a really, in many ways, horrific scene where her fiancé has to stake her. And he's the one who's chosen to do that because he is her fiancé. And there's this repetition of the word, he thrust and he thrust and he thrust the stake. And there's all this blood, and she's writhing around in agony, but it really resembles kind of agony ecstasy. So it is a very much of a sexualized scene, but a way, but also in large ways a rape scene, right, where female sexuality is contained in that moment. And so I think you see similar forms of containment kind of across, whereas a lot of the women writers, like Joel Gomez, who, when she talks about the sharing of the blood, there's never an intent to take too much blood from anyone or to kill them or to transform them into vampires unless they want to join that life. So it's this idea of taking a little bit of blood to kind of nourish herself, and then there's always a giving that occurs with the taking, so very much this kind of back and forth. So she gives people dreams of hope or dreams of happiness if they're downtrodden or whatever it might be, and then she doesn't take from the same person more than once. So kind of ways that those get twisted and transformed. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Any others? All right.
Thank you so
Great.
much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.